Give it up, Astria! My mother's laughter was a jagged blade, shredding my worth to ribbons, while my sister Eris stood by like a vulture waiting for the kill. They branded me a lucky fluke, a pathetic incompetent, and toasted to my ruin with the arrogance of gods. They thought they were stealing my crown. They didn't realize I was the one setting the federal trap. And the SEC was already holding the match. I swallowed the bile of their betrayal, forcing my heart to a cold, rhythmic beat as I stepped back into the suffocating reality of the evening. The air in the gallery was thick, a cloying mixture of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. From the 50th floor, Chicago looked like a grid of fallen stars, indifferent and cold. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching my reflection. At 32, I finally looked like the woman I had spent a decade trying to become. Polished, unshakable, and self-made. My tailored blazer felt like armor, the fabric crisp against my skin. In the pocket, the weight of a single encrypted flash drive pressed against my thigh. It was the culmination of 3 years of sweat, of 16-hour days in a windowless basement office, and of every cent I had to my name. It was the future of fintech, a next-gen AI algorithm that didn't just predict markets. It understood them. Across the room, I saw my father, Cillian. He was tucked away in the corner, nursing a drink, looking smaller than I remembered. He caught my eye and offered a tired, genuine smile. That smile was the only thing in this room that didn't feel like a transaction. Success, I thought, isn't measured by the height of the skyscraper you own, but by the strength of the hands that helped you lay the first stone. Tonight was for him. I had already drafted the paperwork to announce the Killian Foundation, a grant for struggling artists. I wanted to give him back the dreams he had traded so my mother and sister could live in silk. The hum of the elite was a low roar, a predator's purr. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who claimed to love you, yet felt like a stranger at your own feast? I adjusted my cuffs, the gold links clicking softly. This was my fortress, my empire, or so I believed until the lights began to dim, signaling the keynote speech. I checked my phone. No messages, just the steady pulse of the drive in my pocket. I began walking toward the podium, my heels rhythmic on the polished marble. I was ready to claim my seat at the table. But the stage was already occupied. My mother, Indira, stepped into the spotlight before my foot could reach the first step. The rustle of her emerald silk dress sounded like a warning, a sharp hiss in the sudden silence. She didn't wait for an introduction. She didn't look at me. She seized the microphone with a practiced, triumphant smile that chilled the marrow in my bones. I stopped. The air in my lungs felt like broken glass. I watched her scan the crowd of investors, my investors, with the predatory grace of a woman who had never known the meaning of enough. Tonight is about legacy. Indira's voice boomed, resonant and authoritative. Many of you see Astria and think of the brilliance of this company. But a tree is only as strong as its roots. She paused, her eyes finally flickering to me, devoid of warmth. My youngest has been a diligent facilitator, an able technician who helped realize a vision. But the soul of this technology, the revolutionary AI we celebrate tonight, didn't come from a basement. It was born years ago, in the visionary mind of my eldest daughter, Eris. The room tilted. I felt the heat of the spotlight turn into an icy glare. Indira reached into a podium and produced a weathered, leather-bound notebook. She held it up like a holy relic. This is Eris's original journal from her university days, dated 2018. It contains the core logic, the very DNA of the algorithm you've all come to admire. Astria merely executed her sister's brilliance. I looked at the notebook. It was a forgery, a meticulously crafted lie. Eris stood beside our mother, her head held high, a mask of humble genius plastered on her face. I wasn't just being pushed aside, I was being erased. The gunpowder of envy in the room was palpable. I could see the investors whispering, their gazes shifting from me to the true visionary. I was being branded as incompetent, a mere secretary to my sister's supposed greatness. My name, Astria, which I had worked so hard to make synonymous with innovation, was being turned into a footnote. Have you ever felt the breath vanish from your body as the people who raised you tell the world you are a fraud? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A person who is a master of herself is a master of the world, and I refuse to give them the spectacle they wanted. Eris walked to the front of the stage, the standing ovations sounding like a funeral march. As she passed me, she leaned in, her perfume a suffocating cloud of jasmine. "Don't ruin the family image, little sister," she whispered, her voice a jagged blade. "You always were just lucky to be in my shadow. Be a good girl and stay there." I felt the urge to reach out and reclaim the notebook, to show them the real logs on my drive, but I knew the theater was rigged. A house built on a lie eventually feels the chill of the truth, but tonight the cold was all mine. Instead of a scene, I took the microphone for a brief, sharp moment as Eris stepped back. The room went quiet, expecting a concession or a breakdown. I looked at Indira. I didn't see a mother, I saw a bankrupt soul. A house built on someone else's foundation eventually feels the chill of the truth, I said, my voice steady, echoing off the high ceilings. I hope the legacy you've claimed tonight is worth the price you've paid in blood, because character is like a tree, and reputation like its shadow. You can manipulate the shadow, but the tree remains. I turned and walked off the stage. I didn't look back at the confused murmurs or the triumphant smirks of my kin. I left the forged notebook exactly where it lay. My heels clicked against the marble floor, a countdown to a storm they couldn't even imagine. As I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the biting Chicago night, my phone vibrated in my hand. A notification lit up the dark, a private, encrypted message from a secure server. Project Zero. Uplink confirmed. I stared at the glowing blue text. "Let them celebrate," I whispered into the freezing wind, the scent of snow beginning to fall. "They've just inherited a ghost." The grandeur of the foyer, with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier, felt like a hollow tomb tonight. I didn't head for the warmth of the living room. I walked toward the kitchen, the heartbeat of the house where so many hollow promises had been made. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of lemon-scented floor wax and the lingering ghost of the evening's expensive catering. I found my mother, Indira, sitting at the massive marble island, a single glass of vintage red wine catching the dim light of the overhead pendants. She hadn't changed out of her emerald silk gala gown. She looked every bit the queen who had just finished a successful execution. I sat down on a velvet-lined stool across from her, my untouched glass of water standing as a barrier between our worlds. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, oppressive ticking of the 1960s grandfather clock in the hallway. A heartbeat for a house that had long ago lost its pulse. Indira didn't look up immediately. She sat with a posture so straight it seemed brittle, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Finally, she slid a stack of legal documents across the cold marble surface toward me. They were crisp, official, and final. I didn't need to read them to know they contained a full transfer of executive power and intellectual property rights to Eris. It was the formalization of the theft I had just witnessed in the gallery. I looked at the signature line, then up at the woman who had carried me. My voice was a soft thread in the vast dark kitchen. "Mother, I never wanted a kingdom," I said, the words tasting like ash. "I just wanted a family that didn't treat love like a transaction." Indira's eyes met mine, sharp and devoid of the warmth a mother should possess. "Love is the luxury of the secure, Astria," she replied, her voice as smooth as the silk on her back. "Security is built on blood and legacy. Eris understands that. You always were too emotional for the reality of this world." I felt a profound sadness, not for the company I was losing, but for the mother I never truly had. I had spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was built to exclude me. I reached for a pen, my movements slow and deliberate. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a scream or a plea. I would sign their papers, not because they had beaten me, but because I was finished living in a house built on shadows. "I will sign," I said, my voice gaining a cold, steady edge. "I'll take what I've saved from my independent consulting and build my own life, far from this legacy. You can have the empire, Indira. I'll keep my soul." A thin, chilling smile touched her lips. a predatory expression that made my blood run cold. She didn't stop me from signing. Instead, she watched as I scrawled my name, effectively orphaning myself from the business I founded. "You always were a dreamer, Astria," she murmured, taking a slow sip of her wine. "But dreams require capital. You should check your balances before you plan your grand departure. A daughter's success belongs to the nest that raised her." A cold spike of dread pierced my chest. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers flying across the screen to open my private banking app. I had worked 3 years as an independent consultant for firms in London and Tokyo, meticulously siphoning that income into a private venture capital fund, my safety net, my escape plan. The screen loaded, the blue light reflecting in my wide eyes. Total balance, $0. I refreshed the page. $0. I switched to my long-term savings. $0. "What did you do?" I whispered, the air in the room suddenly feeling thin and scarce. Indira leaned forward, the emerald of her dress shimmering like a serpent's scales. "You were so proud of your independence, but you forgot who opened those first doors for you. You used a joint access account for your initial consulting fees in college. You never bothered to dissolve the dormant family power of attorney we established when you moved to Chicago." She paused, savoring the shock that must have been written across my face. "I simply reallocated those funds this afternoon." Eris's new lifestyle branding campaign required a significant initial investment. Consider it your final contribution to the family image. The legality of it was as brutal as it was ironclad. In the United States, joint accounts and broad powers of attorney are weapons in the hands of the unscrupulous. By failing to sever the ties of my youth, I had left the vault door wide open. I wasn't just unemployed, I was penniless. My own mother had executed a financial assassination while I was busy worrying about her approval. "You took everything," I said, the glass of water trembling slightly on the counter. "I took what was ours," she corrected. "Now, I believe you have a suitcase to pack. Eris finds your presence distracting." I set the phone down. My knuckles were white, but my spine was made of tempered steel. The suffocating weight of the room lifted, replaced by an icy, absolute resolve. Have you ever felt the moment when the last string of hope finally snaps? It doesn't sound like a tragedy. It sounds like a door opening. I reached out and signed the final page of the handover, the ink black and permanent. I didn't beg. I didn't ask for mercy from a woman who didn't know the meaning of the word. "You didn't just steal my money, Indira," I said, standing up. "You stole the only thing I had left to give you, my benefit of the doubt. Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it isn't going anywhere." Indira believed she had won because she had the papers and the gold. She didn't realize that by taking everything, she had unwittingly given me the greatest gift of all: absolute freedom. I no longer owed them my loyalty, my silence, or my heart. The debt of being their daughter was paid in full tonight. I walked to the pantry and found a small, hand-knitted scarf I had bought for my father, Tillian, weeks ago. It was soft, wool-lined, and warm. I left it on the marble counter with a small note: "For the cold nights." Even in my ruin, I couldn't leave him behind in the chill of this house. I walked out of the kitchen without another word. I didn't look at Eris's closed door as I passed. I didn't stop to admire the art on the walls. I walked through the foyer, opened the heavy front doors, and stepped out into the biting Chicago snow. I had nothing but my coat, my phone, and the clothes on my back. I walked until I reached the sidewalk, the streetlights casting long amber shadows across the white drifts. I pulled my phone out and swiped to a hidden encrypted app. The screen glowed a deep, ominous red. "You think you've taken my future," I whispered to the empty, silent street, my breath blooming in the freezing air like a ghost. "But you've just signed your own confession." I stared at the distant, glowing lights of the federal building downtown. The first snowflake of the storm landed on the screen of my phone, melting instantly over the icon for the SEC whistleblower portal. My family had spent their lives building a fortress of lies, never realizing that I was the one who designed the security system. They had inherited the ghost of a company. I was about to give them the reality of a cage. The car pulled up to a discreet, limestone-fronted medical suite in Gold Coast. It was the kind of place where the wealthy went to make inconvenient truths disappear under the guise of wellness. The room was too white. It smelled of expensive antiseptic and the stale, suffocating scent of old money. I sat on a stiff leather chair, my back straight, refusing to let the clinical coldness seep into my bones. Across from me sat Indira, her hands folded over a designer clutch, her expression one of practiced maternal concern. Beside her was Dr. Eris, a man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that felt like a surgical incision. Indira slid a medical evaluation form across the low table. "Astria, we are all so worried about you," she began, her voice a soft, poisonous silk. "This erratic behavior, starting this business behind our backs, refusing to integrate with the family legacy. It's clear you're suffering from a delusional breakdown. We've spoken to our attorneys. For your own protection, we are moving for an emergency temporary guardianship. It was a legal assassination. Under the guise of a conservatorship, they wanted to strip me of my rights, my voice, and my assets. They wanted to medicate me into silence so they could pick the bones of my company clean." "Doctor." Eris nodded, his pen hovering over a clipboard. "It's for the best, Astria. You need rest. You aren't yourself." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I knew that any display of anger would only serve as fuel for their diagnosis. Instead, I leaned back, my hand resting casually near the cufflink on my left sleeve, the one housing a microscopic high-definition recorder. I stared at Dr. Eris, my gaze a cold, unwavering weight, until he shifted uncomfortably and looked at his shoes. "Mother, you are trying to medicate the conscience you failed to give me," I said, my voice echoing with a heartbreaking calm in the sterile room. "I forgive your fear, but I will not inhabit the cage you've built for it. You think a signature on a medical form can erase a person. You're mistaken." The observation began immediately. I was escorted back to the family estate, not as a daughter returning home, but as a prisoner of medical necessity. My primary phone was confiscated at the front door. My childhood bedroom, a place that once held the dreams of a young girl, had been transformed into a gilded prison. A security guard sat in the hallway, his shadow falling across the gap beneath my door. I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the ghosts of the girl who used to beg for Indira's approval. Have you ever realized that the people who share your blood are the ones most capable of treating you like an inanimate asset? I looked at the familiar floral wallpaper and felt the crushing weight of their care. They didn't want me to get better. They wanted me to go away. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. I understood that now. They wanted me to scream, to fight, to prove my instability. But my silence was now my most lethal weapon. Let them believe they had won. Let them think the youngest daughter was finally broken and sedated. In the quiet of that room, I found a tactical patience I didn't know I possessed. Would you stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you risk everything to let the truth scream through the wires? For me, the answer was written in the code they tried to steal. I waited until the house settled into that heavy, artificial silence that comes with midnight. I moved to the closet, reaching deep into the lining of an old, battered suitcase I'd kept since my first internship. Inside was a second, ultra-thin laptop, a machine never registered to the house or the company. I didn't dare touch the estate's Wi-Fi. Instead, I activated a satellite uplink I had built months ago as a contingency. A digital bridge they couldn't burn. The screen flickered to life, the blue light washing over my face. I initiated a double encrypted connection, bypassing the firewalls of the family network. My fingers moved with a rhythmic precision, the sound of the keys muffled by the thick rugs. Connection established. Agent Sterling, SEC. I wasn't just a victim trapped in a bedroom. I was a whistleblower with a front row seat to their destruction. I began the massive data dump, uploading the red flag transaction logs I had been tracking. Downstairs in the library, Eris was likely celebrating her new title, unknowingly signing the very shell company transfers I was currently flagging for federal investigators. I meticulously documented the money trail, how the funds drained from my personal accounts were being laundered through offshore entities to prop up Eris's fraudulent branding campaign. It was all there, under the Dodd-Frank Act's whistleblower program. I was handing the SEC the rope my family was so eager to hang me with. The blue screen reflected in my eyes, a digital heartbeat in the dark room. A message blinked on the secure terminal from Sterling. We have the uplink. The data is volatile. But listen to me, Astria. If they find that laptop before we can move, the legal shield won't be enough to protect you. Stay invisible. A heavy thud sounded in the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I closed the laptop and slid it back into its hiding place just as the shadow of a figure stopped at the base of my door. The brass handle began to turn with agonizing slowness. I lay back on the bed, closing my eyes, and regulated my breathing to the slow, heavy rhythm of someone lost in a medicated sleep. The door creaked open. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across my face, smelling of my mother's perfume and the cold, metallic scent of a victory she hadn't yet realized was a funeral. The door creaked shut, sealing me back into my gilded prison, but my mind was already moving past the walls. The scent of Indira's perfume lingered, a sharp, expensive trail of lilies that felt like a funeral shroud. I stayed motionless until the heavy thud of the security guard's boots moved down the hallway. My family was celebrating a victory that was actually a slow-motion collapse. I didn't wait for the sedative of their care to take hold. I had work to do, and time was a luxury I no longer possessed. I slipped out of my room, moving through the shadows of the back wing toward the one place where truth still lived. Killian's art studio. The air here was different, thick with the scent of turpentine, linseed oil, and old dreams. My father was hunched over a canvas, the harsh light of a single desk lamp illuminating his trembling hands. He looked like a man trying to paint his way out of a storm. "Astria," he whispered, not needing to turn around to know it was me. He produced a physical external drive from a hollowed-out book on his shelf. This was the black box, the original code of my empire and the private ledger Indira thought she had shredded. "I've watched them try to erase you," he said, his voice cracking. "I won't let them take your soul, too." I stepped forward and took his worn, paint-stained hands in mine. They were the only hands in this house that hadn't tried to strangle my ambition. "Kindness is a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see, Dad," I whispered. "You're the only one who still speaks it to me." I pressed the drive against my palm, feeling the cold weight of our leverage. I promised him then that once the SEC moved, I would take him away from this museum of ghosts. The heavy studio doors burst open with a violence that shattered the silence. Indira stood there, her eyes narrowed into predatory slits as they landed on the drive in my hand. "Give it to me," she demanded, her voice a low, jagged blade. She didn't ask, she lunged. A chaotic struggle erupted in the cramped space, the smell of fresh oil paint mixing with the heat of a desperate betrayal. Killian stepped between us, his frail frame a shield for my future. Indira didn't hesitate. She shoved him with a force born of pure, unadulterated greed. I watched in a sickening slow motion as my father fell backward into a rack of metal easels. The sound of his head hitting the iron was a hollow, wet thud that will haunt me until my dying day. He slumped to the floor, his eyes rolling back before slipping into unconsciousness. The drive clattered to the floor, but Indira didn't reach for it. Instead, she stopped. She looked up at the security camera in the corner of the studio, her face transforming in an instant. The predator vanished, replaced by a mask of hysterical terror. She began to scream for help, her voice shrill and practiced. "Security! Help! She's hurt Killian! Astria's lost her mind!" She fell to her knees beside him, cradling his head while framing me for the very violence she had committed. Security and Eris swarmed the room within seconds. I was thrown against the wall, my arms pinned by men who were paid to believe whatever Indira said. I watched from the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold wood, as my mother whispered lies of comfort into my father's ear while pointing a trembling finger at me. Have you ever seen a person weaponize their own victimhood to destroy the person they claim to protect? Indira stood up, her face returning to the icy stillness of a Chicago winter. She didn't look at the husband she had just injured. She looked at me with the triumphant malice of a victor. "Throw her out," she commanded the guards. "I will be pressing charges for elder abuse. You are no longer a daughter of this house, Astria. You are a danger to everyone you touch." The guards dragged me toward the service entrance, my feet scraping across the floor. I looked at the security camera, then back at my mother. The most dangerous lies are the NHAT ones we tell ourselves to justify our greed. She truly believed she was the hero of this story. I realized then that I was truly alone, framed for a crime against the only person I loved. As the heavy iron gates began to close, I looked up at the balcony. Eris was standing there, a glass of wine in her hand, watching my exile with a bored curiosity. "I'm leaving because I love Dad enough not to let his pain be in vain," I yelled, my voice cutting through the freezing air. "I hope the house you've stolen feels warm tonight, Eris, because the wind is coming for it." I stood on the sidewalk as the gates locked with a final metallic click. The Chicago snow began to fall in thick, silent sheets, blurring the world around me. My father's drive was tucked safely inside my boot, the only piece of my life I had managed to save from the fire. Across the street, the headlights of a black SUV flickered on, cutting through the dark. Agent Sterling was waiting in the shadows of the vehicle. But from the other direction, the blue and red lights of police cruisers began to reflect in the icy slush at my feet. A dual herald of my arrest and my liberation. The storm had finally arrived, and I was the only one who knew which way the wind was blowing. The frozen mud from the streets of Chicago still clung to the soles of my shoes as I stood before the glass-enclosed press conference room at the company headquarters. A week had passed since the night the gates of my home were locked. I wasn't forgotten. I had been utterly eradicated. But tonight, I stepped back into the light, wearing the mask they had created for me. The hall was an ocean of aggressive camera flashes and hungry reporters, their lenses pointed like weapons toward the stage. At the center stood Indira and Eris, looking like icons of corporate victory in their tailored suits. I entered from the back, my footsteps swallowed by the plush carpet. I had chosen a muted, charcoal gray dress, my hair pulled back with a severity that made me look weary, almost brittle. To the public eye, I was the cautionary tale, the daughter who flew too close to the sun and burned her wings. Indira took the podium, her voice projecting a charitable resolution to our family dispute. She spoke of my supposed emotional instability and incompetence following my father's accident, framing her theft as an act of maternal mercy. "Astria needs time to heal," she told the world, her smile a perfect poisonous curve. "And the legacy of this company is too precious to leave in trembling hands." I played my part with a calculated vulnerability, keeping my head down and allowing my hands to shake slightly as I approached the microphone. Internally, I was a machine of cold logic, observing the exact moment Eris's ego reached its toxic peak. Even as they mocked my character in front of the city's elite, I secretly prayed for Tillian's speedy recovery in the hospital. I looked out at the sea of reporters, my voice weak and broken. "Family is a circle of trust," I said, catching Indira's triumphant gaze. "And once that circle is broken, all that remains is the duty to protect the truth. I am here to fulfill that duty." They took my words as an admission of defeat. I let them. Their arrogance was the tool I needed to bring them down. To avoid the criminal charges Indira had staged against me for elder abuse, she demanded a final, comprehensive, release of liability and final asset handover. Eris was practically vibrating with greed, her eyes fixed on the document that would officially name her the youngest billionaire CEO in Chicago. She wanted to erase my name from the buildings, the patents, and the history books. She didn't just want my company, she wanted my existence to be a footnote in her biography. I hesitated at the podium, looking at the heavy fountain pen as if it were a branding iron. "I will sign," I whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "But I beg for one small mercy. To protect the family name from any of my past incompetent mistakes, Eris must take immediate and total legal responsibility for all past and future operational audits. I don't want my failures to haunt her reign." Eris scoffed, a sound of pure, unadulterated condescension. She snatched the pen, her signature a flourish of ego that ignored the fine print. She signed the document without a second glance, believing she was taking my throne. The legal reality was far more lethal than she understood. Under the principles of successor liability and assumption of liability in the United States, Eris had just legally tied herself to every fraudulent transaction and shell company transfer I had already reported to the SEC. By demanding total responsibility for the audits, she had unknowingly signed a confession disguised as a victory. She thought she was inheriting an empire. She was actually stepping into a gallows I had built with her own ink. Indira leaned in as the cameras flashed, the scent of her perfume a suffocating cloud of victory. "You're nothing now, Astria," she hissed into my ear. "Just a ghost in the house you built. Go find a quiet corner to disappear in." I looked at her with a gaze so chillingly calm it made her hand falter on my shoulder. "I'm not a ghost, Mother," I replied, my voice a steady rhythmic pulse. "I'm the one who just turned the lights off. Enjoy the dark. A man who is a master of himself is a master of everything else." I realized then that my perceived incompetence had been my greatest shield. It allowed me to move unnoticed through their defenses while they were busy building their own gallows. I didn't feel the need to argue or scream. I had already won. They were just waiting for the news to reach them. The air in the headquarters felt stagnant, a room full of people celebrating a house made of cards. As I walked away from the podium, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my executive badge. I didn't hand it to them. I dropped it on the floor, a seed left to rot in the soil of their corruption. I thought of Tillian, lying in his hospital bed, and I knew the path to his freedom was now paved in the very ink Eris had just used to sign her life away. I wasn't losing a company. I was gaining a future. Outside the headquarters, the biting Chicago wind felt like a clean, sharp blade against my skin. I walked toward a nondescript black sedan waiting at the curb. Agent Sterling sat in the driver's seat, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. I slid into the passenger seat and handed him the signed handover agreement, the paper still smelling of Eris's expensive ink. Sterling checked his watch, the digital numbers ticking down with a clinical indifference. "The gala is in 48 hours, he said, his voice low. "The SEC has the warrants ready. Are you ready for the fireworks, Astria?" I put on my sunglasses, the reflection of the company's glass tower shimmering in the lenses like a dying star. "I've been ready for years," I said. The night was like a cold, transparent mirror reflecting the city's vanity. I stood in that glass-walled press conference room playing the role of a broken exile. The historic ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel was filled with suits, silk dresses, and the incessant sparkle of diamonds. The scent of expensive perfume and fine champagne permeated the space, a sweet mask concealing the decay beneath. Indira and Eris were the center of attention, gliding among the crowd of powerful brokers with the predatory grace of sharks in shallow waters. I stood at the entrance, my presence deliberately creating an air of incongruity. I had been invited by formal decree from my mother, a command to witness Eris's final coronation as CEO. I knew her intentions. This wasn't a party, this was a public humiliation. I was the ghost of the party, a cautionary tale brought to light to highlight the successor's excellence. The arrogance required to invite her own victim to a victory parade was the blind spot that would lead to failure. The music swelled, a sophisticated orchestral hum that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. Indira took the stage, the light catching the emeralds at her throat, stones bought with the money she had drained from my life. She didn't just give a keynote, she gave a eulogy for my reputation. Standing under a harsh, prearranged spotlight, I listened as she called me a shameful mistake of nature and a lucky parasite finally purged from the family legacy. The room went silent, the elite of Chicago watching me with a mix of pity and practiced indifference. I stood motionless, a stoic statue in the center of their gilded cage. I didn't feel the sting of her words. I felt the weight of the justice that was mere seconds away. A lie is a heavy burden to carry, but the truth is a light that eventually burns the hands of those who try to hide it. I thought of my father, Tillian, lying in a hospital bed because of their greed. Every insult Indira hurled was just another brick in the wall she was building around herself. I didn't need to scream, I just needed to wait. The moment arrived with a cinematic suddenness. Eris stepped forward, her face flushed with the heat of stolen power, raising a crystal flute of champagne for a toast to the new era. Suddenly, the audio system let out a piercing, high-pitched screech that made the guests wince. The giant LED screens behind the stage, intended to display the company's new, Eris-led branding, glitched and flickered. The sleek corporate logos vanished, replaced by a violent emergency red screen that bathed the entire ballroom in the color of a warning. A live news feed from Bloomberg and CNBC overrode the gala's internal system. The headlines scrolled in bold black and yellow across every screen in the room. Federal investigation. SEC issues emergency arrest warrants for Indira and Eris. The broadcaster's voice was clinical, cutting through the opulent silence like a blade. They named them publicly, detailing a criminal investigation into market manipulation, money laundering, and a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. In the United States financial sector, a publicly named status on federal warrants is a death sentence for a reputation. I watched in slow motion as Indira's glass slipped from her hand. It hit the stage with a sharp, crystalline crack, the red wine spilling like blood, a cinematic symbol of an empire's final collapse. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open, the sound echoing like a gavel. Special Agent Sterling and a team of federal agents entered, their dark suits and official badges a stark, cold contrast to the evening's finery. They ignored the elite crowd, moving with a purposeful, rhythmic stride straight toward the stage. The power brokers who had just been whispering Indira's praises scrambled out of the way, eager to distance themselves from the stench of a federal crime. Sterling approached the podium, cutting the microphone with a sharp click. He began reading the warrants with a cold, professional tone that brooked no argument. Indira looked at me, her face a mask of crumbling terror. "Astria, do something!" she screamed, her voice cracking for the first time in her life. "Fix this!" I simply stepped out of the spotlight and into the shadows, a silent witness to the storm I had summoned. Success is not final, and failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. I realized then that I was the only one in the room with the courage to be honest. As the agents moved to handcuff my mother, I looked at her with a profound, sad understanding. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was a woman caught in a trap of her own making. "You traded a daughter's love for a stock price, Mother," I said, my voice barely a whisper above the chaos. "Now you've lost both." She reached out, her fingers clawing at the air, but the law was a barrier she couldn't cross. I felt no joy in her arrest, only the immense, heavy relief of a burden finally being lifted. Eris tried to flee toward the service exit, her silk gown rustling in a frantic, undignified escape. But Sterling was faster, his hand firm on her shoulder as he blocked her path. I walked toward them, my heels clicking softly on the marble. I held up my phone, the screen glowing with the handover agreement Eris had signed 48 hours ago. "You signed for the throne, Eris," I said calmly, watching the realization dawn in her eyes. "You legally assumed every audit, every transaction, and every crime. Now you get to stay for the sentencing." The ballroom was a scene of visceral justice, the high-stakes reality of a family that thought they were above the law. I watched the agents lead them away, the flashes of the press now turning into a barrage of evidence against them. I turned my back on the feast of fools, the diamonds and the champagne now just relics of a broken dream. My eyes were already fixed on the exit, my mind already moving toward the hospital where Killian was finally waking up. I had built this empire, and tonight I had saved it by letting its predators consume themselves. The hallway outside the ballroom was a clinical contrast to the opulence I had just left behind. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on marble replaced the orchestral swells, and the cold, blue dawn of Chicago began to bleed through the arched windows. I watched as federal agents led Indira and Eris toward a fleet of waiting black SUVs. Their designer gowns, once symbols of an untouchable dynasty, now looked like nothing more than costumes of shame. Indira saw me standing near the exit, her face a frantic mask of smeared mascara and desperation. "Astria! Stop them!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Tell them it was a mistake. Use your connections. Call the board. Do something." She lunged toward me, but the handcuffs bit into her wrists, pinning her arms behind her back. For a second, I saw the woman who had tucked me into bed 30 years ago, but the memory was as thin as tissue paper. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply reached into my coat and pulled out a copy of the handover agreement Eris had signed with such arrogant haste. "I can't help you, Mother," I said, my voice as steady as the morning tide. The document Eris signed was a legal Trojan horse, by demanding total authority, she legally consolidated every fraudulent ledger and every offshore shell company under her personal responsibility. I provided the SEC with the breadcrumbs, but she's the one who baked the bread. The SEC special agents flanking them nodded with a grim professional finality. One of them, a woman with eyes like flint, looked at Eris. "The successor liability clause you signed is the cornerstone of our case. You've personally certified 20 years of racketeering." Eris let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob. It was the air leaving a balloon. Astria wasn't the criminal they tried to frame in that hospital room. I was the state witness who had protected 2,000 employees by letting the predators walk into their own trap. I looked at my sister, watching the realization of her 20-year sentence settle behind her eyes. "I didn't lead you into this cage, Eris," I whispered, the sadness finally catching up to my throat. "Your own greed held the pen. I just gave you the paper." I felt a profound, hollow ache for the sisterhood we could have had if she hadn't been so hungry for a crown that didn't belong to her. As the SUV doors slammed shut, I turned away from the sirens, leaving the wreckage of their ambition in the rearview mirror. I met Agent Sterling on the rooftop of the headquarters an hour later. The wind was biting, but the air felt cleaner than it had in years. The skyline was a silhouette against a sky that was slowly turning from bruised purple to a hopeful, radiant gold. Sterling didn't say much. He just handed me a tablet showing the live results of the emergency liquidation auction. Using my independent, blind trust and the venture capital fund I had shielded months ago, I executed a preemptive buyback of the family's distressed assets. Because of the right of first refusal and the asset forfeiture laws triggered by the federal investigation, my status as a clean whistleblower gave me the legal priority. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, I was the 100% owner of the company, the patents, and even the family estate Indira had used as a weapon against me. I hadn't just won a battle. I had completely replaced a corrupt foundation with a new entity. I pulled a folder from my bag, the Articles of Incorporation for a new foundation. I had renamed the holding company after Chilean. I wasn't interested in being a billionaire queen. I wanted to be a builder. The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. I planned to restructure everything, focusing on the ethical innovation and the struggling artists that Indira had once dismissed as unprofitable. The hospital room was drenched in a soft, sun-drenched warmth when I arrived. The smell of antiseptic was still there, but it was overshadowed by the scent of fresh coffee and the promise of a new day. Cillian was awake. His eyes were clear, the fog of the medicated rest Indira had forced on him finally lifting. He saw me sitting by the large window, and for the first time in my life, he didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with awe. I walked to his bedside and showed him the foundation papers. He ran a trembling thumb over his own name embossed in gold. "You did it for the truth, didn't you, Astria?" he whispered, his voice a fragile rasp. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, my heart finally finding its rhythm. "I did it for the version of us they couldn't break, Dad. Luck ran out for them. Now there's only the work. Real work. Character is like a tree, and reputation like its shadow. I had finally shed the long, suffocating shadow my family had cast over me to become the tree itself. I didn't feel hate for Indira as I watched the news reports of her arraignment on the small hospital TV. I felt an immense, heavy peace. I had drawn a final, firm boundary, and in doing so, I had saved the only person who truly loved me. I had reclaimed my name from the ashes of a betrayal, not with a scream, but with a life well lived. I stood on the hospital balcony, looking out at the waking city. The streets were beginning to fill with people starting their own days, unaware of the empire that had fallen and risen in the night. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a new message from a secure, unknown number. I tapped it open, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. "The SEC isn't the only one watching your brilliance, Astria. Ready for phase 2? A slow, enigmatic smile played on my lips. I closed the folder on my past, my eyes turning toward a horizon where I was no longer the daughter following a legacy, but the woman creating one.